Like I said at the end of my last video, I am going to make some noise on this channel, so I guess I'll just go ahead and jump into that right now. But first, you may have seen the recent headlines in the news regarding the NASA discovery of a massive 19-mile wide crater found hidden underneath Greenland's Hiawatha Glacier. This crater is a result of an asteroid impact from a nearly 1 mile wide mountain of iron weighing somewhere around, get this, 11 to 12 billion tons, and was traveling at approximately 12 miles per second, which is equivalent to more than 43,000 miles per hour when it slammed into the Earth some 12,000 years ago, and with the mind-boggling force of essentially a 700 megaton bomb. And without a doubt, this is the reason why there is so much mystery and why we know so little about lost ancient human civilization, as this event was so extreme that whatever existing civilizations were around at that time faced a massive reset button, sending them essentially back to the Stone Age and erasing so much of ancient history in a blink of an eye. In fact, to truly appreciate just how significant this event was to planet Earth, the people, animals, and vegetation living on it, let me make a few comparisons to what a 700 megaton explosion would do. Example number 1. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 was absolutely devastating, as it flattened an entire city in an instant, and was equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT. And in case you're not familiar with the math on this, this is essentially a very small fraction to the power of a 1 megaton bomb. But again, that 15 kilotons was catastrophically destructive for a radius of approximately 1 mile. Now let's consider the notable airburst that happened over Russia in 2012, which the fireball itself glowed 30 times brighter than that of the sun. This rock was only 20 meters wide, or 66 feet, yet it blew up in the atmosphere at an equivalent yield of 400 to 500 kilotons. Again, compare that to the just 15 kilotons of the Hiroshima blast, and estimates suggesting that it was essentially 26 to 30 times more energy than the Hiroshima event, powerful enough to seriously injure more than 1,500 people and damaged 7,200 buildings across 6 cities. But thankfully, it exploded in the atmosphere some 18.5 miles up, which significantly buffered the amount of damage that it would have otherwise caused. And here is all that was left of the original 20-meter rock that hit the ground. Absolutely nothing compared to the 19-mile wide crater in Greenland. Let me give you another example to really paint you a picture of the point I'm about to make. The Tunguska Event of 1908 was another airburst that occurred over a remote region of Siberia. It flattened massive trees for 800 square miles, essentially equivalent to a 10 megaton bomb, which was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima blast. Even to this day, more than 110 years later, evidence of this blast is still apparent. There is even a nearly 1,000-foot wide circular piece of land at its epicenter where vegetation will still not grow to this day. So when we consider the newly discovered Hiawatha crater in Greenland being 19 miles across and 1,000 feet deep, and was hit by a 1 mile wide piece of iron weighing as much as 12 billion tons and traveling at 12 miles a second, again equivalent to a 700 megaton blast, is it even possible for us to comprehend the devastation that this would cause throughout the world upon impact? And listen to this, even if the massive chunk of iron that caused this crater was only 10 billion tons, which was the conservative estimate, it would have still generated energy of 47 million times stronger than that of the Hiroshima bomb. That's right, 47 million times stronger. And this was said to have happened when man existed on Earth between 100,000 and 12,800 years ago. And of course, scientists usually give approximations and ranges of time, but in this case, there really should be no doubt at all that this event happened at that 12,000 year mark, as the information I'm about to share with you is so overwhelming that you will have no doubt. But what's crazy is that this evidence has already existed for years, but has been shunned by the mainstream scientific and academic communities, which, yes, absolutely does exist, just as it always has. Because there have been numerous examples throughout history where the groupthink mentality have ridiculed the works of so many brilliant people only to be vindicated years later. I mean, Copernicus presented evidence that the Earth rotated around the sun and that the sun did not rotate around the Earth, and he was shunned. Galileo built off of his evidence to straight up prove it as fact, but was going to be tortured to death for simply sharing that evidence in a book. Hundreds, if not thousands, of the smartest people alive at that time chose to ignore the evidence that was right in front of them, thus conforming to the primitive tribal mentality that the human brain is so susceptible to. And in doing so, set humanity back from forward progress, and I regret to tell you that it's no different today. In fact, a very recent study from just earlier this month outlined that even the smartest of human beings alive today are very susceptible to the tribe mentality. Nowhere is this more obvious than in modern politics. However, the same exact mindset consumes much of the scientific and academic community as well. This has long been painfully obvious to many open-minded, logical thinkers. However, a scientific case study now exists that proves that this is indeed the case, that groupthink mentality is real and is as prevalent as ever. In fact, one of my earliest videos on this channel discussed the topic of how a cataclysmic event involving an asteroid strike wiped out ancient civilization nearly 13,000 years ago, and in that video, I discussed several lines of evidence that are supported by the most recent scientific studies and peer-reviewed data. Details that most of the general public have never heard before, so real quick, let me just sum up the bullet points of that evidence, as it will tie into the premise of this video and really paint you a picture of just how, behind the curve, the mainstream scientific and academic communities have become when it comes to connecting the dots on the most recent empirical scientific data. But several things are all proven to have happened on Earth at precisely the same time, roughly 12,500 years ago. First things first, there was a mass extinction event of 75% of all mammals in North America, and most of the skeletal remains date to 12 to 13,000 years ago, the same exact time frame of the recently discovered Greenland crater. Now, many of these animals you had no idea ever existed at all, as they don't teach much about it in the American public school system. But of course we are all familiar with the notable woolly mammoth and of course the saber-toothed tiger, but were you aware that camels originated in North America? That's right, and they were known as camelops, and actually are very similar to the camels that exist in the Mid-East today, but notice the extinction date of closer to 12,000 years ago, and hold that thought as I share a few other fascinating species that also existed in North America at that time, such as the giant ground sloth. Just look at this thing. The claws themselves are larger than my head, and most people have never even heard of this incredible species. And yes, they were around when humans were as well. Or how about the giant short-faced bear? Significantly larger than polar bears, which are the largest bear species on Earth today. And the short-faced bear is about double the size of the largest modern-day grizzly bears. But also notice the date of its extinction, some 12,500 years ago. Another incredible fact is that lions once existed in North America as well. Most people have certainly never heard that before, and also notice their extinction date of roughly 13,000 years ago. But even cheetahs existed in North America, and again, notice their extinction date of some 12,000 years ago. Just like the saber-toothed tiger, all of these species went extinct right at the same period of time, basically between 12 to 13,000 years ago. Now hold that thought for just a moment as I share with you a very recent discovery from less than a year ago, which was a study published in the Journal of Geology which identified that there were massive fires, even larger than the ones that took place during the extinction event of the dinosaurs, that scorched at least 10% of all the Earth's landmass, with scientists speculating that it must be related to some unknown cosmic impact. And the date on this? 12,800 years ago. The same exact period of time as the beginning of the Younger Dryas climate interval, which is marked by a black mat layer, also known as the Younger Dryas boundary, which has so far been found throughout some 30% of all the Earth's landmass today, covering multiple continents and spanning from the western United States to as far away as Syria. This black layer is virtually identical to the KT boundary, which marks the extinction event of the dinosaurs from the massive asteroid that hit Earth some 66 million years ago. Both of these layers consist of all the trademark elements of a cosmic impact, including microspherules, melt glass, nanodiamonds, iridium, platinum, and extraterrestrial helium, to name just a few. And again, this layer dates to 12,800 years ago, which just so happens to be the same exact period of time as the mass extinction of animals as I just shared, but also when the Clovis culture, which was a massive culture so large that they occupied nearly the entire continent of North America, and they mysteriously went extinct some 12,000 years ago, which scientists have recently started saying that it is likely related to some unknown cosmic impact event. And guess what else occurred at the 12,800 year mark? A sudden and rapid rise in global sea levels. In fact, ice core samples taken from both Antarctica and Greenland confirm that something happened to cause a surge in sea levels, with some estimates stating that it could have been as much as 30 feet in a 24-hour period and exceeding 50 feet in just one single year. And when you consider the fact that most of the world's population lives on or near a coastline, this basically confirms the some 500 legends of a flood that have been discussed by cultures all over the world, spanning across 5 continents, including that of the biblical flood, which of course some will say never happened because it's impossible for every mountain on Earth to have been covered with water, and that it's impossible to put all species of animal on Earth into one single boat. But obviously, when you look past that, obviously the Andes Mountains and the Himalayas were not covered during this event, but the very fact that hundreds of cultures across several continents, all sharing the same story of a massive cataclysmic flood, and now that we have scientific data that there was a possible 30-foot surge in sea levels in a remarkably short period of time, this should get us all thinking. I mean, that's like having the 2004 Indonesian tsunami happen all over the world in one single day. Think about that. Although not everyone on Earth would die, a disturbing percentage would, and it would also be a reset button to the current paradigm of our current civilization, essentially a reset button, as all systems of supply chain, communication, electricity, travel, etc. would collapse in almost an instant. So when we consider the fact that this 12,000-year-old crater found in Greenland is the result of an asteroid impact to the then continent-sized ice sheet that was more than 1 mile thick on average and even exceeding 2 miles in thickness in many areas, that equates to some 6 million cubic miles of water volume. To put this into comparison, all of the Great Lakes of North America combined equate to 5,200 cubic miles, barely a fraction of the amount of ice that would have instantly melted following this impact event, which of course explains the anomalies identified in the ice core samples taken from opposite sides of the Earth. You know, this makes me wonder if this is the same event that was tied to the said destruction of Atlantis having sunk into the depths of the ocean, which of course was the topic of my last 3 videos. But it seems apparent that the west coast of Africa was massacred by catastrophic flooding, the same area of the Recot structure. Just something to think about, but I digress. If the flooding wasn't bad enough to make it all worse, this event of 12,800 years ago was followed by a 1,200-year deep freeze, where global temperatures plummeted. So when we combine the new data of this Greenland crater dating to the 12,000-year range, there was an initial blast that essentially created melted Earth through 30% of the landmass as identified through the Younger Dryas boundary layer, and then it was immediately followed by more than 1,000 years of an ice age. And this was all at a time when humans were alive on Earth, and they faced what can only be described as an apocalyptic event. Fascinating, right? But for some reason, none of the articles on this topic connect the dots on any of the information that I just shared with you. In fact, you will not find one single mainstream scientist or academic connecting the dots on any of this information. And what's even more disturbing is that when alternative researchers have discussed these things, they have been publicly ridiculed and then shunned. Take the example of when Graham Hancock appeared on a TED Talk with this information in 2016, which, let me first say that I am a big fan of TED. I have seen many incredibly informative lectures from their organization and those presenting on it. But when Hancock presented an abundance of the most recent peer-reviewed scientific data on this topic, the executive leadership at TED decided to suppress the lecture and then included a pop-up warning at the beginning of the video, which you can see here. And then when you look at the description, they literally state that it is outdated and inaccurate information. So I did my own fact-checking and research and confirmed that no, this actually is the most recent and accurate information that was conducted by legitimate scientists that have nothing to do with Graham Hancock, and all he did was connect the dots on it. I mean, research this stuff yourself and tell me that we don't have a problem here. The suppression of scientific knowledge for the simple reasons that it contradicts what is being taught in school, written about in books and textbooks, been shared on televised documentaries, and essentially is the same information that many professors, tenured professors, have been teaching and handing out tens of thousands of degrees on for decades. So when this information contradicts it, all of a sudden, they don't want to talk about it. And the reason is because this is people's livelihoods. A lot of people in the scientific community have become very wealthy. And so when someone comes around, or anyone comes around, that contradicts their lifelong works with new information, seems that they don't want to hear it. But this is the same exact thing that we have seen demonstrated throughout history. The tribal mentality truly is a prominent and unfortunate characteristic of the human psyche and has clearly affected those in the scientific community. I mean, they are people too, right? Even I got a small taste of it from my prior video on this topic. Look at these recent comments over the last few days, and I blacked out the names as I really am not trying to pick on anyone here, but it's like, this information is easily verifiable. I guess it just goes back to the groupthink mentality where people assume that if it's not taught in school and it's not in the news, well, it must just not be true at all, right? But, I mean, what more proof do people need? A 12,000-year-old video taken from Earth's orbit showing a massive chunk of iron slamming into the Greenland ice sheet 12,000 years ago? I mean, come on. But going back to TED, this evidence of the Greenland crater confirms what many others have been saying for years. And this was the last piece of evidence that was needed, the crater. As scientists said that you cannot have an asteroid impact without a crater, so until that evidence is found, none of this can be taken seriously. And you know what? And just as Graham Hancock pointed out in his TED lecture, the same exact thing happened to the scientists who identified the KT boundary as the explanation for the dinosaurs' extinction. They were ridiculed at first. They were laughed at, and when they brought this theory to the public, it wasn't until someone else finally found the Chicxulub crater in Mexico that they were finally vindicated. So here we are, nearly a month following this Greenland crater discovery, and TED still has all the warnings up on the presentation. That's embarrassing, and they owe it to their open-minded viewers to not be so patronizing, but worse than that, they are trying to suppress known and proven scientific evidence. How is this any different than the fools that ridiculed Copernicus, Galileo, Nikola Tesla, the Wright brothers, and so many others throughout history? And you know what else? Go to the wiki page on this topic, and at the top, they still claim that the evidence does not exist. So yeah, this recent discovery is a profound example of the inability of mainstream scientists to connect the dots on the most recent evidence and data taken from different branches of scientific study and developing logical conclusions, thus ultimately slowing the knowledge and progress of modern civilization. So as for me, I am by no means the first person to discuss these theories. I am simply making videos on topics that interest me that I feel that not enough other people are discussing. However, I do take pride on being the loudest one out there and bringing this information and other information to as many people as I possibly can. I mean, this is fun to me. And I was actually a fraud investigator for a large corporation a few years ago, and so I'm essentially taking the skill sets I gathered there and using it to dive into topics, like I said, interest me, and exposing different truths that the masses are otherwise not aware of. But what I don't get is why me, a veteran with an MBA, why am I the one connecting the dots for these leaders in the scientific community? Like, what are they doing? Like, what's the problem here? Are they too busy, I don't know, creating definitions and writing them in textbooks or something and memorizing them? Like, what's going on? So yeah, going back to what I said at the beginning of this video as far as making some noise on this channel, well, it's time to call out the incredible inaccuracies involving what we were told about lost ancient human civilization. As all the dots connect, that ultimately ties together what I've been stating since the beginning of this channel. And this 19-mile wide crater that generated a blast equivalent to some 700 megatons is indeed the smoking gun evidence that yes, a cataclysmic cosmic impact occurred approximately 12,000 plus years ago and was a reset for what was then a relatively advanced ancient human civilization. Case in point, and here's a fact that most people do understand, which is that we still have no idea how the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed. I mean, it is a mystery. We only have theories on how they cut, carved, and moved these stone blocks, yet every method proposed ultimately failed when tested. And I'll be coming back to that in just a second, but most people have no idea that not one single mummy was ever found in any of the pyramids, ever. Most people are legitimately surprised when they hear that for the first time, but check it for yourself. Since, after all, we were taught in school that, yeah, the pyramids were built to be tombs for the pharaohs, so it's a bit weird that they excluded that part about no mummies ever being found in any of them ever, and that there is actually not one single shred of evidence to even suggest, nor is there evidence to support that the so-called ancient Egyptians that we were taught about in school of 4,000 years ago were the ones who actually built it. And you might be thinking right now, well, of course there's evidence. How could there not be? Well, if you consider some definition in a textbook that wasn't tested by the scientific method as evidence, well, it says it right here. Here's the evidence. Sorry, guys, that's not evidence. And these methods, these theories that they developed 160 plus years ago, apparently they were based on no evidence and they didn't even try to test them at all. In fact, there is literally zero ties that connect the so-called ancient Egyptians to the pyramids. Like I've said in other videos, out of the tens of thousands of hieroglyphs and petroglyphs found throughout ancient Egypt, not one single one of them shows anything about the pyramids. Zero. Most people are surprised when they hear that as well. But not only that, there is not one single hieroglyph or petroglyph inside the pyramids. Zero. Yet if you go to any known Egyptian tomb, they are covered wall to wall in art. Guys, the pyramids were not tombs. They were clearly something else, and I do discuss this in other videos, but the point I'm making in this video is that there is absolutely zero scientific evidence to support that the so-called ancient Egyptians that we were taught about in school could have constructed these structures. Now, I already know that some people will say, and this is because I've seen comments in prior videos, but a couple years ago, one of the greatest clickbait articles ever came out, and they called it the greatest discovery of the 21st century that involved the world's oldest papyrus scrolls that said they tell us how the pyramids were constructed. Unfortunately, most people must not have read anything other than the headlines, and the actual evidence shows that not one single word involving a pyramid is even stated in these scrolls. All these scrolls state is that some limestone blocks were moved on a boat up the Nile River to Giza, which is something that we already knew had happened. And most structures found around Giza that are not the pyramids are without a doubt younger than the pyramids themselves and are all made of limestone. These scrolls literally prove nothing, and it was just a clickbait thing to generate more interest in the topic of Egyptology and tourism. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that the civilization that existed thousands of years before the so-called ancient Egyptians that we're familiar with, they're the ones that constructed the pyramids, and they were wiped out from the events following the Greenland impact. And over the course of some 12 to 13,000 years, all evidence of how they did it was consumed by the earth and decayed to nothing, gone from existence forever. Here's an example to really paint you a picture of just how long of a period of time 12 to 13,000 years is. Scientists say that if all humans were to vanish off the face of the earth today, the very last man-made structure to exist would be the Hoover Dam, which they estimate will weather down into oblivion in some 10,000 years. Yet, the Greenland impact, again, is closer to 13,000 years old, so add another 3,000 years on top of that 10,000 years. The only thing that would survive is stone, and the pyramids are a fantastic example of this. Because after all, the Egyptians were known for being a Bronze Age culture, meaning that their most advanced technology was primitive, made of a combination of copper and tin, and the theory is that this is what they used to cut and carve these stone blocks. But if you think that bronze saws were used to cut these stones, then you have chosen to believe something without any supportive scientific evidence to back it up, which is no fault of your own, because this is what we were taught from an early age. But here's a picture of one of the best preserved bronze saws from the time of the ancient Egyptians. The blade is less than 2 feet in length, and again made of bronze. And they want you to believe that saws like this could have cut and carved 2.5 million stone blocks, as is the case with the Great Pyramid, which, let's not forget, these blocks are several feet in length on average and have 6 sides. And I'm not saying that to be patronizing, but each one of those 6 sides was cut with laser cut precision. And on top of that, there are more than 100 pyramids found throughout Egypt, so we're talking about tens of millions of stone blocks. In fact, the only depictions of the Egyptians using bronze saws at all were on wood, and they were all very small, not nearly big enough to cut the massive size blocks in the Great Pyramid. And here are a few other examples of saws that they have found, all less than 2-foot blades. But No rational person would suggest that a 2-foot bronze saw would or could cut the massive 12-foot by 8-foot granite blocks of the Osirion in Egypt, or with that level of precision. It's just not possible. No joke, apparently various scientists, archaeologists, and leaders of modern academia literally decided to skip over a few parts of the scientific method when stating how these stones were cut, carved, and moved into place. And what's disturbing is that in the last several years, mainstream Egyptologists have actually finally tested these proposed methods and ultimately were completely debunked. They didn't even finish one single block, guys. Yet you never heard anything about it. Ultimately, they didn't hand out the memo and they're still teaching and saying the same exact thing. Tell me that we don't have a problem here. Because that's exactly what they've done. They've been sharing outdated, proven false information for decades. Instead of saying, hey, let's open this discussion to new ideas. Obviously, these methods don't make sense, so what are the other possibilities? They refuse to even entertain the conversation. Why is that? Like I said before, guys, it involves people's livelihoods and money, as well as that groupthink mentality. People don't like change, especially when they thought they knew something their entire lives. Yet, when people suggest that a civilization dated thousands of years prior to the Egyptians, well, they say, well, that's just not possible. But then they chose to ignore that the Egyptians did leave behind detailed lineage of the pharaohs dating back more than 30,000 years. Mainstream historians simply ignore it and say, oh, well, this must be wrong. The reality is that there was once a different age of man that existed here on Earth that was capable of amazing things, and now they are long since gone. And like I've mentioned before, which most people are still not aware of, the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is dated to 12,000 years ago, 50 times larger than Stonehenge, 90% of it is still buried and unseen. This proves that humans were around and doing amazing things far earlier than what they're teaching in school. And this site is somehow oriented perfectly to true north, despite the fact that the North Star was not even in the North sky some 12,000 years ago. So how on earth did they figure it out to such an incredible degree of accuracy? You may have seen the headlines from over a year ago where modern researchers are speculating that this site is essentially a time capsule which is describing a cataclysmic event on Earth that involved an asteroid. Think about that. And actually, while I'm at it, also think about this too. For some reason, there are pyramids all over the world, as if that's just the normal first steps of any emerging civilization. Hey, let's cut a bunch of stone blocks and stack them on top of each other in the shape of a pyramid. No, I'm just not buying that. There was once a civilization that spanned the Earth, and they learned how to do some amazing things, and they were eventually wiped out, along with all the evidence of how they did it. There are so many other examples of our ancient past that are complete mysteries, and I look forward to building off this information in further videos, but this is getting a bit long, so I'll wrap it up here. But the point is this: there is a serious issue in the mainstream scientific and academic community, guys, and what the world needs now is more open-minded, logical thinkers, because it's 2018, almost 2019. We have incredible technology to communicate on a global scale. So we need to start getting the word out and pushing for new ideas to be thought of, because apparently this old guard community that's running the show involving our ancient past, they just don't want to change, and they are quite literally ignoring and not unwilling or unable to connect the dots on fascinating details, guys. It all comes back to that groupthink mentality and the tribal nature of us as humans. This is just who we are, and we need to be more aware of it. But I guess I'll wrap it up there. I have my next video lined up. That will be out in the next week to 2 weeks max. In fact, I have 2 videos that will absolutely be updated or posted in the month of December for sure. So no having to wait on me for another month between videos. Thanks for waiting, guys. I really appreciate it. But leave me a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on all of this. Obviously, this is a touchy subject. Many people with lots of opinions, but it's time that we start looking at the actual scientific evidence. That's what it comes down to. But anyways, I'll leave it at that. I'm Jimmy. This is Bright Insight. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll have another video out real soon. Take care, everybody.